So the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals just heard oral arguments on the ATF's new rule on frames and receivers. This hearing has huge implications not just for this rule, but also for the ATF's new rule on pistol braces. So let's talk about this. But real quick before we jump into this video, I want to thank one of the sponsors of this channel, which is Sonoran Desert Institute. SDI is an accredited online college that helps students learn the skills and techniques they'll need to be successful in the firearms industry. So if you enjoy gun repair, ballistics, and learning about firearms, SDI might be a good option for you. To find out more about SDI, you can visit them using the website link down below. And thank you again to SDI for sponsoring this video. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we will be discussing the GOA and 17-state lawsuit against the ATF and their new rule on frames and receivers. The case we will be talking about in this video is called Morehouse v. ATF, and this case had recent developments and had recent oral arguments take place before a 3-judge panel at the 8th Circuit level. This case was originally filed in North Dakota in a federal district court. GOA requested that the district court judge there grant a motion for a preliminary injunction to stop the ATF from enforcing their new rule, which was set to take effect on August 24th of 2022. However, on review, the district court judge here, Pete Wilt, found that under Bruin and other concepts, an injunction was not warranted in this case. He stated in his decision that the court believes the ATF's response to the Second Amendment concerns brought up during the notice and comment period to the proposed rule was sufficient. As noted in the final rule, concerns regarding constitutionality of the proposed rule were raised by multiple commenters. The ATF appropriately responded by indicating its belief that the proposed rule was consistent with the Second Amendment's jurisprudence at the time the final rule was drafted, and explained why. It is difficult to fathom what more the ATF could have said in response at the time, as it could not have predicted the future development in the law. So the judge in this case believed that the Bruin decision does not impact the ATF's new rule here on frames and receivers, since during the notice and comment period of the proposed rule, the ATF made claims in responses to why they believed that the Second Amendment was not implicated at that time. The judge essentially gave the ATF a pass that Bruin came out after the proposed rule, after it was drafted, and therefore he essentially said that they addressed it when it was originally proposed, when they originally drafted it, and that's all they really needed to do. But keep in mind, the Bruin decision was released a month before the ATF finalized their final rule on frames and receivers, and it came out 1 month before they published it. And in response to that denial of the motion for preliminary injunction, GOA in the 17 states then sought an appeal up to the 8th Circuit. And recently, the 8th Circuit had oral arguments before a 3-judge panel. During the oral arguments, there seemed to be some main points of focus, so I'm going to kind of point those out. First, there were 2 judges who seemed to question why the ATF should not be afforded Chevron deference to clarify what the definition of frame or receiver is. There was also some pushback by one of the judges against the ATF on the actual language of the GCA. The GCA mentions parts in the dangerous weapons section, in the dangerous weapons language, but they do not mention parts at the firearms definition section. The judge here seemed to believe that if Congress intended parts to also be included in the definition of a firearm, they obviously could have added that language like they did in the dangerous weapons section. The same judge also asked a similar question on the issue of serialization and who is required under that language of the statute to serialize a firearm. The judge stated that if Congress intended for dealers to have to serialize an item, why didn't they include dealers into that language, into that section, like they did with gun manufacturers? Similar argument, but they're just applying it to a different section in different language. The ATF's attorney argued that this was simply because Congress did intend for the language on serialization to be broader, but that privately made and privately manufactured firearms were just not as prevalent at the time the language was drafted. Essentially, the ATF argues that Congress would have and likely intended for this to apply to dealers in privately manufactured firearms, but they just failed to cover all the language. They failed to include that there. So now ATF is coming in and doing it for Congress because that's what they intended all along. Then some of the judges asked questions to the attorney who was representing the 17 states in this case. One of the judges seemed to question if these states and the attorney here even could prove standing for the states to be part of this lawsuit. The state's attorney argued that the states here did have standing because the states were interested parties. They are engaged in their own law enforcement actions, which would be impacted by the ATF new rule on frames and receivers. The state's attorney focused heavily on how the final rule was not a logical outgrowth from the proposed rule that was submitted by the ATF, which we all saw and then commented on. She argued that the ATF violated the APA by drastically changing the final rule without allowing the public the ability to comment and address those changes. The judges here did push back against those arguments, asking if she was taking the position that the ATF simply can't ever change a rule from the proposed rule to a final rule. She responded by saying that obviously the ATF and other agencies can change a rule from a proposed rule to a final rule, but they cannot completely change the underlying theory that the proposed rule is based on, completely change the underlying theory from one thing from the proposed rule to the final rule to the point where they are not even similar at all. Now, I will say one of the worst points and arguments for the ATF was when the attorney for the ATF was trying to explain the serialization requirements and essentially what would happen if you had to go to a gun store with your privately made firearm and essentially you needed it to be repaired or to be serviced or for something to be done to it. But when the judges found out that if the item went into the gun store's inventory, then the gun store would have to, in fact, serialize it. So if the firearm was there overnight to be serviced or to be Cerakoted or whatever, then it would need to be serialized. And a lot of the judges found issue with that. And I think that's where the ATF had the most pushback in the oral arguments. And I think that's where some of the judges started to realize how arbitrary this rule can really be. Some of the judges seemed concerned by the ATF's position that a Coke can in your house or an everyday material found in your own home could in fact be a suppressor part and therefore be subject to the new rules regulations. There was a lot of concerns about that. And again, I think that shed light on the ATF's new rule and how arbitrary it could really be. So that's my general takeaways after listening to the oral arguments here before the 8th Circuit. Personally, I don't think the temperature of the judges was very much in our favor. A lot of the questions that they were asking seemed to feel like they were leaning towards the ATF and the ATF's arguments. But really, I think that's because the judges don't fully understand what an unfinished frame or receiver is or what a polymer 80 is. I think this is really going to be one of those cases that maybe fails because the judges here lack a clear understanding of the issue at hand and also what items we are in fact dealing with. Obviously, I'm simply listening to the audio version. I wasn't in the room. I didn't see the judge's demeanor or anything like that. So my take could be wrong. For all I know, it's going to be a 3-0 decision in favor of GOA. We don't know right now. We're going to have to wait and see. But regardless, that's kind of just my main takeaways after listening to the oral arguments. I think regardless, this case is eventually going to make its way up to an en banc panel review in the 8th Circuit. And then eventually it's going to make its way up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court will have to finally decide whether or not they want to deal with ATF overreach. Regardless, I want to give a shout out to GOA, who's litigating this case, to Steven and the team over there who's doing a great job handling this case. If you appreciate what GOA is doing, fighting the ATF, fighting for our rights, I highly recommend you guys go over to their website, wherever you can find it, donate to them, support those organizations that are supporting us and who are actually fighting the battles. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and comment down below and I'll try to answer to the best of my ability. Also, if you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm and a signal to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of 2A news. As always, I want to thank everybody who likes, comments, subscribes, who hits the notification bell, who shares these videos. You guys are directly impacting these videos, impacting this channel, and helping me to reach and educate more people than I could ever do on my own. So as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.